My brother grabbed a microphone at his own rehearsal dinner, tapped it twice, and grinned at the 200 people sitting in that banquet hall in Charlotte. He was in his element. He always was. I want to thank everyone who helped make this weekend possible, he said. Mom, Dad, you two have been incredible. And of course, my best man, my college roommate, my actual ride or die. He raised his glass toward his friend at the end of the table. I was sitting 3 seats away from my parents, not beside them, not in the family row they'd reserved near the front. I was at the corner of the table, wedged between my brother's girlfriend's cousin and an empty chair where someone had moved their jacket. Then my brother laughed into the mic. That easy, comfortable laugh that had always filled every room he walked into, and said, "And hey, my little sister's here somewhere too." She's the one who spent 4 years in college and still can't figure out what she wants to do with her life. The room laughed. Not cruelly, just easily. The way people laugh when someone they trust tells them something is funny. I smiled. I don't know why I smiled. I think it was reflex. My mom, sitting 3 chairs away, didn't look at me. My dad was already chuckling, nodding along. My brother moved on to the next toast point before anyone had time to notice that I'd stopped breathing. I was 24 years old. I had a biology degree from UNC Charlotte, a job at a medical billing company I'd taken because I needed health insurance, and a studio apartment in Concord I split the cost of with a roommate who was never actually there. I was not lost. I was just not my brother. And in my family, those 2 things had always meant the same thing. His name was the first word in every sentence my parents spoke with pride. His soccer scholarships, his finance degree, his 6-figure job at 26, his beautiful fiancée with the perfect family from Raleigh. My parents had put his college photo on the mantle. They'd framed his first bonus statement. I'm not exaggerating. I saw it in a drawer once when I was looking for tape. They printed it out and kept it. Mine wasn't up there. Nothing of mine was up there. I grew up understanding that I was the supporting character in a story my brother was the hero of. It wasn't that my parents were mean to me. They weren't. They remembered my birthday. They asked how work was going. They just didn't lean forward when I answered. They didn't ask follow-up questions. With him, they took notes. After the rehearsal dinner, I drove back to my hotel room by myself, sat on the edge of the bed, and called my best friend Lena. How bad? She asked. She didn't need context. She never did. He made a joke about me in front of everyone, I said. At his own rehearsal dinner. Silence on the other end. Then, are you going to the wedding tomorrow? I have to, I said. I'm in the photos. That was the other thing. I'd been asked to be in the wedding. Not as a bridesmaid, but because, as my mom had put it, we want the family photos to look complete. I wasn't part of the wedding party. I was a prop in the family portrait. I stood in the 3rd row, behind my parents, behind my brother and his new wife, behind the people who actually mattered to the story being told that day. The wedding was beautiful. Of course it was. My brother had always known how to build things that looked exactly right from the outside. At the reception, my dad gave a speech. He talked about watching his son grow up. He cried, actually cried, at the part about my brother's first soccer game. He said, I knew from the very beginning that this boy was going to do something great. I sat at table 9, not the family table, not even close. On the drive home the next day, I replayed the weekend in my head, not to wallow. I think I was just trying to figure out when I'd stopped expecting things to be different. I'd been trying to earn it my whole life, I realized. The lean forward. The follow-up question. The thing where a parent looks at you across a room and their face just changes. Because you walked in. I'd graduated college. I'd gotten my own apartment. I'd stopped asking them for money at 22 even when I was eating rice and beans 4 nights a week. I'd built something small and quiet and mine, and none of it had ever made my parents' faces change the way his did. 2 weeks after the wedding, I stopped calling home every Sunday. It wasn't a decision I announced. I just didn't pick up the phone. And then a week went by, and then another, and then I realized they hadn't called me either. That told me everything. I didn't go no contact in a dramatic way. There was no letter, no confrontation, no tearful phone call where I laid out every grievance. I just withdrew. quietly. The way you stop going to a restaurant when the food has never actually been good and you finally admit it. I threw myself into my life instead. I changed jobs, got a position as a patient services coordinator at a cardiology practice, something that actually used my degree, something I was genuinely good at. I started running in the mornings. I made friends at work, real ones. I started dating someone, a guy named Seth I met through a coworker. And for the first time in my adult life, I was in a relationship where someone actually wanted to hear what I was thinking. Time is a strange thing when you stop looking back at it. It moves faster than you expect. I turned 25, then 26. I got promoted. Seth and I got a real apartment together in the Nodon neighborhood, the kind with a little balcony and a coffee shop on the corner. Lena visited for a long weekend and said, "You look like yourself finally," and I knew exactly what she meant. I didn't think about my brother's toast that often. But when I did, it didn't land the same way anymore. It had shifted from wound to data point, something that told me more about him than it did about me. I talked to my parents maybe 3 or 4 times a year. Holidays, if I felt up to it. Brief calls, surface level. My mom would give me updates about my brother's career, his wife's promotion, their new house in the suburbs of Raleigh. I would say things like, "That's great," and mean nothing by it. I was 31 when my phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon, and I saw it was my mom. I let it go to voicemail. That was habit by then. But then she called again, and then a third time, back to back, which she had never done. My mom was not a back-to-back caller. She was barely a once-a-month caller. I picked up on the fourth call. "Your brother's in the hospital," she said. She told me he'd had a cardiac event, 34 years old, no prior history, and he'd collapsed at work on a Monday morning. His coworker had called 911. They'd gotten to him in time, barely. But he was in the ICU at Lake Medical in Raleigh, and he was going to need surgery, and the doctors had said the recovery was going to be long. I sat very still with the phone against my ear. "We need you here," my mom said. "Your father can't drive anymore, not since his eyes got worse. And I can't do this alone. We need someone to help get us back and forth to the hospital. Help us deal with everything." I heard it clearly. Not, "We miss you." Not, "We should have called more." Not even, "I know things have been distant," but, "We need someone." "I'll think about it," I said. "He's your brother," my mom said. "I know," I said. "He could have died." "I know," I said again. I hung up and sat in my car in the parking garage for 22 minutes. I know it was 22 because I watched the clock. I thought about the rehearsal dinner. I thought about table 9. I thought about the family photo where I was in the third row. I thought about my dad's speech and the part where he said he knew from the very beginning his son was going to be great and how I had sat at table 9 and clapped. I also thought about the fact that my brother was 34 and had almost died on a Monday morning. Those two things existed at the same time. I didn't know how to make them not. I called Lena. I called Seth. I talked it through in circles. Seth said, "The question isn't whether he's your brother. The question is what going there would actually mean and what it would cost you." That was the right question. I thought about what going there would look like. My parents would need logistics support. Rides, coordination, dealing with insurance paperwork, probably managing food and medications. I was actually good at all of that. It was half my job. And my brother, whatever had happened between us, was in an ICU bed at 34. But I also knew how this went. I knew that if I drove to Raleigh and managed the crisis and made myself useful and kept everything running, my parents would absorb that labor completely and give me no more credit for it than they ever had. I knew I would stand in a hospital waiting room and feel like the third row again. I thought about that for a long time. Then I made a decision. I drove to Raleigh on Thursday morning. But I did something I had never done before in my life. I drove there knowing exactly what I was willing to do and what I wasn't. I had thought it through. I had written it down actually in my journal the night before. Not a list of demands, just a clear picture of my own limits so I wouldn't lose them the moment I walked through the door. I would help. I would coordinate. I would make sure my parents got to and from the hospital. I would not shrink. I would not perform gratitude for being included. I would not sit at table 9 and clap. My mom cried when she saw me in the hospital lobby. She grabbed my hands and said, "Thank you for coming." She meant it. I could tell she meant it, and I let myself feel that without either inflating it or dismissing it. My dad looked older. He hugged me for a long time without saying anything. That was new. My brother was out of the ICU by then, moved to a step-down unit. His wife was with him. She looked exhausted and scared and young in a way I hadn't seen her before. I walked into the room. My brother looked at me, and something crossed his face that I couldn't quite name. Not guilt, exactly. Something more like recognition. Like he was seeing something clearly that he'd been blurring for a long time. "Hey," he said. "Hey," I said. I sat in the chair by the window. His wife excused herself to get coffee. We were quiet for a minute. The machines beeped steadily in the background. "I'm glad you came," he said. "I almost didn't," I said. "I didn't say it to hurt him. I said it because it was true, and I was done performing versions of things that weren't true." He looked at the ceiling. "The rehearsal dinner," he said. "Not a question." "That was one thing," I said. "It wasn't just one thing." He didn't defend himself. That surprised me. He just nodded slowly, still looking at the ceiling, and said, "I know I made it hard to be my sister." I hadn't expected that. I don't think he'd expected to say it. We sat with it for a while. "I was the easy one to put the weight on," I said eventually. "The joke. The one who hadn't figured it out yet. It made you look better by comparison, and I don't think you ever actually needed that, but you took it anyway." He turned and looked at me. His eyes were tired in a way that had nothing to do with the surgery. "You're right," he said. I did. I didn't cry. I thought I might, but I didn't. I felt something quieter than crying. Something more like finally setting down a bag I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten it at weight. I helped my parents for a week. I drove them back and forth. I talked to the discharge coordinator. I organized his medications. I made sure his wife had a list of everything she needed to know. I did all of it competently, and without anyone thanking me enough, and without expecting them to. On my last day there, my mom pulled me aside in the hospital parking garage, late afternoon, that particular slant of light that makes everything look a little more serious than it is. "I know we haven't always," she started. "Mom," I said, "you don't have to." "I want to." I waited. "I don't think we ever really saw how much we put on you," she said, "or how little we gave you. I've been thinking about it all week. I don't have a good excuse for it." She looked at me. She was 70 years old, and she looked like she meant it, and I believed that she meant it, and I also knew that meaning something and changing something are two different things. "I hear you," I said, "and I hope things can be different going forward. But I'm not going to pretend the last 7 years didn't happen. I can't go back to what we were, because what we were wasn't working for me." She nodded. She didn't argue. She looked like she'd known something like this was coming for a long time. I drove back to Charlotte that evening. The whole way, I kept waiting to feel sad or angry or relieved or something large and definitive. But what I actually felt was small and clear, like a room that had finally been tidied up. Not fixed, not solved, just honest. Finally. Seth had dinner waiting when I got home. He didn't ask for a full debrief right away. He just handed me a bowl and sat next to me on the couch and let me be quiet for a while. "How do you feel?" he asked eventually. I thought about it, like I went there as myself, I said. "Not as the third row." He nodded like he understood exactly what that meant. "My brother recovered. The surgery went well." He texted me a few weeks later. Not a long message, just, "I've been thinking about what you said. I want to do better. I know that's on me to prove." I read it twice. I wrote back, "I know. I hope you do. I don't know where things go from here with any of them. I don't have a clean answer. I'm not waiting for an apology that finally says the right words, or a single conversation that fixes 20 years of being the punchline. What I know is this. I drove to Raleigh on my own terms. I helped because I chose to, not because I was needed and needed to be needed. I walked into that hospital room without shrinking, and I said the true thing out loud, and I drove home to my apartment, my balcony, my coffee shop on the corner, and the person sitting on the couch waiting for me. That's not a revenge story. I know that's not what people come here for, but it's the true one, and I've spent enough of my life performing the version that made other people comfortable. That part is done. I used to think the hardest part was the rehearsal dinner, the mic, the 200 people laughing, my own smile, automatic and hollow, like my face hadn't gotten the message yet. But sitting in that hospital parking garage 7 years later, watching the clock tick to 22 minutes, I realized the rehearsal dinner wasn't the wound. It was just the moment I finally let myself see how long the wound had been there. That's the thing about cause and effect that nobody talks about. It's rarely dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. Every Sunday dinner where I gave an answer and nobody leaned forward. Every phone call where my mom listed his achievements and I said, "That's great," and she heard nothing off in my voice because she wasn't listening for it. Every table nine. The consequences of those small, repeated choices, theirs and eventually mine, didn't arrive all at once. They arrived as distance, as silence, as me, alone in a parking garage, genuinely unsure whether to drive 4 hours for the person who'd made me the punchline of his happiest night. What I know now is that the version of me who drove to Raleigh was not the same version who sat at table 9 and clapped. Something had changed in the years between, and I think it came down to three things I had quietly, without realizing it, been building. The first was just knowing right from wrong and being willing to hold that standard for myself, not just for other people. It sounds simple. It isn't. Because when the people who raised you behave badly, there's a pull to excuse it, to minimize it, to call it complicated. Naming it clearly, my family treated me as less, and that was wrong, took longer than I want to admit. But once I named it, I couldn't unname it, and that clarity became the foundation of every good decision I made afterward. The second was learning to actually think, not react. Think! When my mom called 4 times in a row, my first instinct was guilt, the old reflex. But I sat in my car and I actually worked through it. What is being asked of me? What can I genuinely offer? What will this cost me? And am I choosing to pay that or just defaulting to it? Lena had taught me to ask those questions by asking them herself, out loud, for years. Seth had taught me by waiting while I answered them instead of just telling me what to do. Thinking clearly, I'd learned, is not something you do alone. It's something you practice with people who respect your process. The third was the part nobody gives you credit for, showing up anyway on your own terms after everything, driving to Raleigh knowing it might go badly, walking into my brother's hospital room without knowing what he'd say, telling my mom, in a parking garage at dusk, that I wasn't going back to what we'd been, and meaning it, not as punishment, but as truth. That took something I can only describe as the decision to keep going when it would have been easier and more comfortable to stay home. My brother is recovering. My parents are older. I still live in my apartment in Noda with Seth and the coffee shop on the corner. Things are not fixed. I don't think they will be, not fully. But I drove there as myself. And I came home as myself. That's the only version of the story I know how to live in anymore.